He was the kind of man whom the city forgot by degrees. Boots left by the door, a kettle that whistled only in old stories, a shirt carrying the faint perfume of other people's laughter. On a day of gray paper and thin rain, a small, impossible insistence arrived at his threshold. Not a letter, not any neighbor's knock, but a living, patient wait that settled at the edge of his doorway. The world held its breath and the cat held its tail. It was no sudden miracle. It was a summons the size of a finger, the rustle of a paw, a soft chapel of steps the way a creature can speak without words. He had kept grief like weather. It sat on his shoulders, learned his habits, taught him how to move through rooms without claiming them. Yet the cat, arriving like a small secret bell, introduced the odd possibility that the room might answer back. In that first hour, when the kettle forgot to sing and the rain remembered its promises, the man lifted his hands as if to meet someone from far away. The cat blinked once as if to say, "Begin." He stepped forward, hesitant, his heart open. He had lived for months under a slow, polite siege. The room around him kept its company in silence. Curtains that closed against unfamiliar light. A clock that moved with the dignity of a man who disliked hurry. A small shelf of books whose spines had learned to know his eye and keep quiet. The building itself had settled into its creaks like a congregation that refused to leave. Even on windy evenings, the stairwell hummed a hymn to familiarity. Outside, the city performed its continual commerce. But within his apartment, the small domestic things had arranged themselves into a calendar of absence. His name remained, but it had acquired the softness of things preserved behind glass. Neighbors used it with a cautious politeness the way one might mention an old song. He answered when spoken to in market voices. Short, practical exchanges that kept social obligations intact without demanding more than the smallest of energies. Former professions and seasons of the self retreated into the corners of his memory like photographs turned to the wall. He had been a man of accounts and careful orders, a husband whose life had once been organized by the light in another chair. Now those seasons lived like relics that sat politely on the shelf of his mind. Grief had settled upon him not with violent declaration but by rearrangement. It taught him the architecture of absence, how to set a second cup without its use, how to leave one place at the table empty as if the air itself were still warm with presence. He kept one photograph, small, framed, the kind with worn edges, on a sideboard where it caught lamplight like a private constellation. He watered a single plant by the window because the act of pouring water required that his hands make a small promise every few mornings. These small rituals were scaffolding for a man learning to stand again. Neighbors performed gestures with the soft exactness of folk who mean well. An old woman on the landing left a pot of soup during the long winter. A boy from the next floor fetched a newspaper without comment. A neighbor's daughter placed warm bread on his doorstep with a note folded like a curtsy. These were not the grand interventions of novels, but they were the steady, ordinary kindnesses that acknowledged his continuing attendance in the world. He accepted them with the gratitude practiced by those who know that charity is sometimes a quiet thing. Then the cat arrived in the unassuming language of animals. A scraping, a soft insistence, a presence at the threshold that measured the world with its paws. It did not arrive with trumpets or fanfare. It arrived the way weather arrives, an alteration so ordinary the first moments pass without remark. He first registered it as a disturbance at the edge of the window, a narrow silhouette that took the light and made something of it. It sat upon the sill as if it had always belonged to that patch of air. He noticed the cat's habit sooner than any attempt to name it. It could balance on the narrow rail of the window as if the rail were a spine it trusted. It came to the door at certain hours and sat, not begging but performing a quiet vigil. The man learned to read these motions the way a mariner reads stars. When the cat paced the length of the hall 3 times, it seemed content. When it padded to the back of the cupboard, something had interrupted its calm. He did not name the creature. He feared that naming would conjure obligations he might not keep, so he let it be the cat. A phrase both insufficient and somehow tender. Plants in his rooms began to find their voices. The bay tree on the windowsill took on an unconcerned nobility, its leaves trembling in a steady salute to light. In the alley below, a stubborn fig sapling had forced itself through a crack in the paving and pushed upward, a green defiance that could not be read as anything other than hopeful. The man watched that sapling from his kitchen window, measuring its growth against the slow marks of his life. The fig's persistence told a story he liked to believe in. Life insists. even when the pavement seems to forbid it. At first, the cat offered small, domestic economies. It took its place at the foot of his chair as if to hold watch. It pressed its cheek against the rib of the radiator and warmed the place on the cushion his hand had once loved to rest. Its purring was not a cure, but a device that altered the air in the room. He began to match its cadence with his breath, counting cat purrs between the rain's taps on the roof. The cat did not speak in human languages, yet its habits taught him a vernacular of attention, the slow, patient grammar of being present. The creature brought gifts, modest, intimate things rather than dramatic trophies. One morning it laid a scrap of paper on the mat with a precision that read like ceremony. The scrap was damp at one corner and carried the imprint of a child's stamp. He could not place the handwriting and kept it under his teacup as if preserving a small, ridiculous treasure. The bay tree by the window shed a single leaf that week. He placed it beside the scrap, thinking these two small objects might be footnotes in a new argument, that the world in its smallness still offered calls and tokens. He learned to leave simple offerings in return. The corner of toast warmed on a saucer, a shallow sip of milk taken in the quiet hour, the leftover butter from a single slice. The cat accepted these with a reserve that felt like ceremony. It did not overindulge. These exchanges were not commerce but reintroduction. Each gesture a small bridge from the man's practiced solitude toward a richer possibility of being needed. People who have been alone long enough come to value these tiny economies more than large gestures. The cat's acceptance taught him that his hand still had uses that mattered to another being. His habits mutated around this new gravity. When the cat slept in the center of the rug, he stepped around it as if it were a relic of sanctity. He caught himself speaking aloud to the photograph on the mantel, as if the woman in it might answer. He arranged her scarf with the same old care. He found that presence begets presence. The living being of the cat suggested others could be returned to life by small attentions. Rhythm for the grieving is a kind of return. The cat provided a rhythm he had not known his days required. Neighborly speculation arrived with whisper and worry. Some said the cat had chosen him out of mercy. Others commented with an economy of compassion that pets do not mend grief but only occupy hours. Grief has left empty. He received these opinions with the patience of someone who would not be hurried by other people's conclusions. Instead, he attended to smaller proofs. The times the cat refused food, the way it rubbed its head against the bay tree, the moments when it sat and watched the stairs as though expecting a shape. Symbols began to gather like marginalia. A brass key, anonymous, ordinary, and heavy with suggestion, appeared in his mailbox one morning with no note attached. The old woman on the landing, who spoke to geraniums as if they were children, tucked a folded slip of paper under his mat with a repairman's number and a crinkled blessing. These small interventions suggested the city had not entirely withdrawn its care. The world beyond his threshold still found ways to press its fingers into the seams of his life. A private notebook became a habit. It was ridiculous, he thought, to carry paper in an age of devices, yet the notebook felt like a vessel for oddities the cat offered. He jotted the hours when the animal came and left, the peculiarities of its stare, the days when it refused a saucer. The act of writing made the small events measured and thereby more durable, an insurance against the forgetting that had for a time seemed inevitable. And then, with that domestic modesty that characterizes the most decisive pivots, the inciting thing occurred. It had no trumpet nor telegram, no dramatic summons. It arrived precisely the way the cat always had, ordinary, intimate, and therefore impossible to dismiss. One morning the creature presented a ribbon. It was faded, red worn to the softened color of old summer, and attached at its end by a careful knot was a damp scrap of paper. He untied it as one unfastens a relic. On the paper, in a hand that suggested haste and intent, were 4 words. "Meet me where the fig grows." No signature, no address, only those words assembled like an imperative or a benediction. He felt the room tilt as if a small tectonic motion had begun under his floorboards. The bay tree shivered and let a leaf fall upon the sill. Outside, the fig sapling pushed through the paving crack as if to answer the summons. The cat placed its head upon his knee and looked up so plainly that he felt the obligation to reply. The ribbon in his palm was both absurd and exact, a small courier's token that asked for a choice. Remain in the shelter of practiced inaction where grief sat as furniture, or step into the damp street and follow that brief instruction toward an encounter that might rearrange what he believed finished. The kettle began to sing its small, cheerful call. The fig's new leaf flashed with the plausibility of possibility. The man who had learned to live in measured absence found his feet moving toward the door. That ribbon and its terse invitation were the inciting disturbance, a precise, domestic thing that compelled him to answer. It would not do to ignore such politeness. The room waited, the plant waited, and the cat, having executed its delivery, sat at the threshold, bearing witness, patient as the weather. If this gentle story touched your heart, subscribing keeps this quiet little corner alive. He walked as if the world had thinned into a single lane, and that lane led him, halting and curious, toward a place he had never meant to visit. The ribbon's knot had become a summons, the fig sapling a rendezvous. Under roofs that smoked and gutters that sighed, he followed the cat. No trumpet, no courier, only the small, unfaltering tread of a creature whose compass was something older than schedules. Rain made the paving shine like black glass, and every puddle reflected a brief, private sky. The city around him kept on with business. Shops opened, a tram groaned, a dog barked at some storm-scented philosophy, but he walked through that bustle as a man moving through memory. The cat threaded the alleys with the confidence of one who knows every seam. It paused at a gap in a brick wall where the world leaned in and listened, and then it slipped through as if the crack were a door meant for those who had forgotten how to knock. He hesitated at the threshold of a little hidden garden and felt, for the first time in many months, that his feet might do something more than carry weight. They might answer. So he stepped after the cat, leaving behind the tidy gravity of a life practiced in silence and following instead a small insistence that smelled of wet earth and possibility. The garden was a thing of misfit loyalties, a patch of green elbowing itself into the city's indifferent cheek, a dozen pots and a handful of chairs arranged with the patience of people who had learned to wait. It sat under a sagging railway arch where the sound of trains was a constant hollow drum, an old reliable heartbeat for a place that liked to believe in constancy. The fig sapling rose from a crack in the paving like an argument that would not be silenced. Around it, people tended the soil as if they were repairing something larger than the land. Time, perhaps, or the habit of being seen. They looked up as he entered, not with the glare of novelty, but with the curious caution of those who have learned to measure arrivals. An old woman, she who kept geraniums on a balcony and spoke to them as if practicing long-cultivated politeness, sat by the bench and smiled with the careful generosity of someone who had been expected. A tall young man with the hands of someone who had once lifted crates and now lifted seedlings made him a nod that was almost ceremonial. A child scarcely taller than the fig's newest leaf ran fingers through the dirt and did not look away when he watched. The cat did not need introduction. It became the grammar of the space as soon as it entered. It threaded between knees, inspected watering cans with a diplomatic nose, and then went to the sapling. There, with the discretion of a small priest, it sat and did what cats do to sanctify. Blinked slowly, accepted a leaf for a forehead. The man found himself standing at the periphery, listening to conversations he had not thought to have again, as if these people spoke in the old, patient language of those who refused to let the city forget its tender corners. "Thought you might come," said the old woman. Her voice had the kind of assurance that is not unkind. It belonged to someone who knows that grief is less like a wall and more like weather you can put on a coat against. He did not answer at once. His hands remembered the weight of a teacup and the way it used to be warm in another life. He set his palm upon the sapling's tiny trunk as if to check whether it, too, was still living. They told him, in touches rather than declarations, what the garden was. A place for the city's overlooked things, plants that had been discarded by balconies, animals with no home, notes folded and left by people who wanted to be remembered. The garden was called by none of those formal names. It was simply the place that would hold what the streets could not keep. Here, tokens were kept, a chipped cup, a ribbon, a tiny wooden soldier, the kind of objects that carry more truth than formal statements. He learned that the ribbon the cat had delivered was not random. "It's our custom," said the tall man whose name was said to be Amin, as if the name were an apprentice in charm. "When something calls someone back, well, the ribbon goes out." He explained in sentences that tripped lightly around the edges of explanation that the garden often performed small, delicate errands. It received and passed on like the city's gossip, but softer. His pulse, which had been accustomed to careful, even beats, quickened. The scrap of paper that had come tied to the red ribbon fit into the garden's ledger, an orderly little book of arrivals and responses. The ledger's pages crinkled like the skin of old fruit. Each entry was a talisman that said, "Here, we mark that you came." He watched them make a small ceremony of it, no words, only the sliding of a page and the light touch of a fountain pen, as if to note the arrival of a weather shift. As the sun edged lower, the city's clamor distanced itself, and their small assembly became an island with its own rules. A kettle simmered on a portable stove. Someone broke bread and distributed it as if passing judgment. He received a piece without thinking. It tasted of yeast and the possible. Hands passed through his, offering warmth, and he realized with a start that he had been unused to that contact and had scaled it to the size of small shocks. When people gather for purposes that are not loud, they have a way of creating a separate history. They told him about their reasons. Some had been drawn by a stray animal, others by the stubbornness of a plant, some by a loss that could not be spoken in the rooms where decorum still lived. Each story was a stitch in the garden's cloak. A woman who had built a nest of newspapers to keep a fledgling, a mechanic who repaired a birdcage and then left it by the bench as a place for secrets, a schoolteacher who brought late-return novels to the shelf. He told them little of himself at first. Words came in fragments, an accounting of days, the name of a person who had been lost, the small manner by which loss had become an instruction. They listened with a kind of reverent ordinariness, and what he considered the private tasks of his sorrow softened by degrees into a conversation others were permitted to touch. That permission felt like a tether that might keep him from drifting. Escalation arrived not as a storm, but as a series of practical troubles. A notice pinned by the archway, yellow at the corners and official in its font, declared that the land had been sold to a developer. The date for demolition was set within a fortnight. The word on people's lips, clearance, had all the mellowness of financial terms, but the implication was absolute. If the garden were cleared, the fig sapling and the small tokens would go with the sweep of heavy boots. The cat, who had been attentive but impassive, twitched an ear and sat more rigidly than before. The man's first reaction was the old reflex of retreat. The garden was not his to save. He had not the appetite for public battles nor the confidence to call in favors. Once he had balanced ledgers and argued numbers until his voice found traction in rooms that sanctioned importance. Now that muscle lay dormant. Grief had eroded the certainty that had allowed him to stand before men and say, "Do not come." Yet the garden's threatened fate tugged at him with a force that was oddly personal. It had become a place where his sorrow could map itself onto something living that might survive its small indignities. The people in the garden had not given up. They moved as if they had been waiting for someone who understood order to cross their threshold. "You know how to count," the tall man said softly to him, an observation, not a command. "We need hands that remember certain things." The request was practical. Help us draft a petition, organize signatures, make the bureaucratic inconveniences persuasive. The stakes were immediate. The developers had papers and schedules. Those with petitions had only voices and signatures. If the man could marshal his old habits, his capacity to translate compassion into argument, the garden might stand a chance. He resisted at first. The privacy of his grief had been the last sanctuary, where he allowed himself to be the exact diminished shape he had become. To re-engage felt like exposing a healed cut to the air. He made excuses, his health, his obligations, the dull ache of a calendar he did not trust. But the cat, who understood the difference between excuses and errands, sat upon his shoe and refused to be placated. The animal's attention was not a demand. It was a preference that had the weight of an invitation. The choice hummed like an insect, to remain the careful reckoner in his kitchen, or to step into a small civic skirmish where the outcome might matter in a way he had not yet allowed. He found himself thinking of the fig sapling's stubbornness, the way it had found purchase in a crack and persisted. The image lodged where his resolve often did not within grand notions, but in the concrete proof that life could wedge itself into adversity and push up. He imagined the sapling lost, replaced by a neat pavement and a line of branded shops. The ribbons not untied and flung away. The thought lodged like a thorn. He agreed to help. This decision was an axis turning of modest degree and profound consequence. Once he had committed, The cities in different gears became very small and detailed problems that required counting. He began to draw lists, to compose letters that translated affection into policy language, to talk to a clerk at the council office who smelled of paper and bus routes. Each act of administrative attention reintroduced him to himself. He found usable parts he had assumed gone. The garden, which had been a soft communal thing, sharpened into a cause that needed leadership. The man's skills, formerly employed in balance sheets and prudent forecasts, were exactly what was required. He began to model financial arguments. What could be lost in community terms, what rent of arbitration might be paid, proposals for relocation and preservation that made the garden legible to people who answered only to ledger headings. He worked with the tall man, with the old woman, with a small parade of volunteers, translating hope into paper. As the week shortened toward the date on the yellow notice, tension collected like damp under a closed umbrella. People who had been placid in their sorrow found themselves moving quickly. The child who had been content to dig began to run errands, knifing through the city with messages. Support arrived in curious tributaries. A teacher brought a class to plant bulbs. A baker donated loaves. A lawyer, a stranger who had once loved a tree, offered to look at the papers. The city's private kindnesses gathered as if by magnetism. Midway through these preparations, in the slow dusk between errands and a last communal supper, the old woman paused and addressed the small circle, fixing a needle of attention on each face. "Have you ever had an animal wait for you when you didn't ask them to?" she asked, with the sort of rhetorical patience that invites confession rather than demands it. "Do you believe cats know when we are at our lowest?" The questions hung between them with the lightness of snowflakes. They were invitations to reckon with the soft, undramatic miracles that stitched people together. He answered in his mind before he answered aloud. He thought of the nights when the cat had settled beside his arm and seemed to count his breaths. He thought of how animals know not the arc of legal notices but the small measures of presence. He believed it, and when he said so, his voice had the small crack of a man returning to words. Around him, heads nodded and stories resumed like the threading of a familiar tune. Conflict increased, practical and human. A man from the council requested a meeting. His suit smelled faintly of new plans and older indifference. He listened to the man explain the inevitability of development. His language was the language of progress. The man, the one who had been solitary and careful, found himself articulating different values: community, memory, the city's moral ledger. He argued not with passion but with accountancy. The cost of tearing out a place that provided mental shelter, the intangible capital in neighborhoods that remember their own. His voice, rusted though it was, made arguments that human beings could hear. Yet for every small victory there was an annoyance. A representative of the developer arrived at the archway the morning a petition was being circulated. He wore a suit with a calculated indifference and moved like someone who had learned to open and close doors without looking at them. "This has been assessed," he said, producing a folder whose edges had been shaved clean by confident hands. "We have the rights to clear." He smiled with an economy of warmth. "It's time to move on." The cat, who had no patience for the cool rituals of men in suits, arched along the developer's cuff and left a smear of soil as if to mark the sort of company he kept. This small affronting gesture drew a sharp look from the man in the suit. He did not speak. He merely turned his gaze to the sapling with the consideration of someone who expects nothing to matter beyond the balance sheet. The man, who was learning to speak in clerkly and human languages in tandem, felt an impulse rise like a tide of salt. He could have retreated to the safety of numbers, to the small things he knew how to do best. Instead, he composed a letter, not dry but insistently human, to the developer's office citing heritage value, petitions, and the simple, inconvenient fact that people had begun to gather there as if expecting rain. He attached signatures and a ledger of small community services the garden provided: compost for elderly gardeners, a place for stray animals to find water, a shelf of donated books for the children of the street. This did not close the matter. The developer's answer was bureaucratic and cold. The scheduled date remained. The people of the garden worked by other means. They wrote, petitioned, gathered, planted saplings deeper, and wrapped them with burlap for protection. They organized a small press. A local reporter came and made readings into a microphone about streets that protect the overlooked. The city had many ears and some were listening. Amidst this practical scramble, personal complications unfurled. An old acquaintance, someone from the man's former life whose name had been tied to conferences and dinner, appeared at the garden one evening. He was a man who remembered the protagonist's old confidence and wanted to revive arrangements that made him useful in the old sense. "You should step into the world of decisions again," he suggested with the amiable brusqueness of a man who never learned hesitancy. His presence, meant as encouragement, had the odd effect of making the protagonist feel both seen and unready. The two men argued quietly about duty. Was it to the past or to the present? The acquaintance suggested more public actions, press conferences, and partnerships. The garden, to the protagonist, felt fragile enough without spectacle. The turning point approached not with fireworks, but with the patient insistence of a cat settling into a lap. As the scheduled day drew nigh, a plan formed. The garden would host a small public event, an open afternoon where neighbors could come, sign, and declare simply that the place mattered. The man took responsibility for the logistics: tables, sign-in sheets, a brief speech that would be offered as both invitation and record. When the day arrived, the archway filled with people: toddlers, a woman pushing a pram, an elderly man who brought a folding chair, the baker with his tray of day-old pastries. The energy was gentle but resolute, like a group of people holding a light against a wind. There was also a harder edge. The developer sent a representative. His presence was a blot on the day's tenderness. He watched the assembly through an eye trained in the calculus of land. At one point he made a motion as if to summon enforcement, and a small crowd tensed. An argument grew. Words that had been quietly held now rose in pitched lines. The man, who had been practicing saying things again, stepped forward to speak. He did not fashion himself a hero. He simply read their petition aloud, the names rattling like tiny beads of insistence. He spoke of the garden's small chores: feeding birds, sheltering cats, holding a bench where someone could be allowed to remember. His voice grew steadier as it moved. Victory was not total. The developer left with a polite promise to consider. The scheduled date would still stand unless official channels reversed, and reversals require time. They bought a breath, a week or more of life for the fig and its neighbors. But victory had also a shadow. During the scuffle, a man, someone who had not wanted to be noticed, had watched from an alley. He was broad and had the look of someone paid to make people leave quieter places. He had not yet shown himself, but his presence lodged like a small dark pebble. That evening, under a sky the color of old coins, they celebrated with a modest supper. The cat moved between knees, rubbing itself against the man's shin, insisting on a small final claim. People swapped stories. The child presented a drawing of the garden in crayon, and the old woman produced a music box that she wound and set between cups like an offering. The man felt an odd warmth, an extension of the small human economies he had recently re-entered. For the first time in months he dreamed, not in grand visions but in tiny ones, that some small corner might remain as a place of belonging. Then came the discovery that pitched everything toward a new and sharp turn. While preparing to plant a thornless rose near the sapling, the child's trowel struck something buried beneath the soil. It was a small wooden box, dark with age and wrapped in a ribbon of the familiar red. The garden fell silent in the particular way that happens when a thing once thought private comes into the public light. The man knelt, fingers clumsy after weeks of municipal drafting, and unfastened the ribbon. Inside lay a folded paper, slightly damp as if it had been waiting for the exact season to be read. There was too an object, a key, the sort of ordinary noble key that fits neither door nor lock until the right hand holds it. The paper bore a line in a small rushed script: "If you have come, then follow the sound of the fig. There is more to be told." The handwriting, old, patient, was familiar enough that his stomach turned. The sentence was a summons, true and edged with withheld reasons. He lifted the paper as if it were both an accusation and an invitation. In that instant, footsteps sounded, heavy, purposeful, coming from the direction of the arch. Voices, not those of tender volunteers, but of the sort that serve edicts, approached. The man felt the warm circle of the garden narrow as the shadow of authority moved toward them. He had opened a door and not yet read the room beyond. The cliffhanger sat then like night at the lip of a day's closing. The garden held a secret plainly labeled for him. The key in the note breathing into the air a history that had not yet been spoken, and outside the arch the sound of boots spelled arrival, authorities or men paid to clear what the city had deemed surplus. He held the paper between his fingers, the ink blurred slightly by his touch, and the cat pressed its head to his wrist as if to demand that he decide. He had committed himself. The path forward, whatever else it might be, would not unmake itself. The boots grew louder. Boots thudded like a metronome across the archway. Voices snapped into business and the garden's gentle pulse stuttered as if something had been missed in counting. He stood with the paper trembling between his fingers, the key's cold weight a small private anchor that refused to let him sink. The cat wound itself about his ankles as if to say, now. The fig's leaves trembled in the same breathless way as a held secret, and the old woman's hand found his with the steadiness of a practiced bell ringer. Around them, the small community held its breath, everybody aware that legal timetables move like tides and that tides are not turned by whispers alone. What had been private, an instruction in hurried script, a key wrapped in red now sat in public air and asked to be read. He could feel the shape of a decision forming like frost on stone. To run with the possibility and risk everything that had recently reassembled him, or to fold the paper back into its dampness and let ordinary erasures finish the place. The cat looked up at him and blinked slowly, as if to measure whether he would answer a summons he did not understand. The boots were almost at the arch. He stepped forward, a man whose ledgered life met a mystery that was not in his books. He moved as if some old, precise skill had returned to his limbs. The city's air curdled around the arch with the smell of diesel and paper. Someone was composing an instruction elsewhere that would arrive in a slim envelope and seal the garden's fate. He felt absurdly like a person rising from a long illness. The first few steps are grateful at their novelty. The cat, light and sure, brushed ahead, weaving between nettles and the old wooden bench. The small wooden box lay on his palm like a cold, kind relic. The key was ordinary to a fault. Rounded head, a simple bow, ridges consistent with locks not designed for grand doors but for drawers, boxes, places that keep private things. Whoever had tucked it 3 inches into the dark soil had known how to hide, not by burying in mystery, but by placing truth under common things. The script on the folded paper, if you have come, then follow the sound of the fig. There is more to be told. Had lived precisely in that middle ground. Part tenderness, part instruction. The approaching voices fractured into nearer sounds. Shouts, not yet anger, but the practical inquiry of men employed to move things that slow progress. We'll need access. Clear that out by morning. The mechanical language of erasure. The tall man, placed a steadying palm against his back and said nothing. The old woman's fingers pressed a hot teacup into his hand. The child handed him the trowel that had unearthed the box. And the little graffiti of the city seemed to repeat itself. Help where help was needed and not always expected. He knelt then, not for ceremony but out of the necessary closeness the object required. The wooden lid came away, and dust that smelled faintly of library shelves rose like the memory of summers. The small chest had been lined with oilcloth as though it had been prepared to protect paper from damp. There were envelopes, each brittle with age, stacked in a hand that had been careful about order. On top lay a folded photograph bound with twine, a photograph of the garden itself years earlier. Its figs small and newly planted, and at the margin someone had written a name with a hand that trembled with affection. He saw in the margin the handwriting of the woman in his photograph at home, the ink that once had addressed invitations and written shopping lists. It was her script. A heat rose that was not shame and not merely grief. It was a signal that he had not misread care. He began to read, slow at first, the way someone reads a map of an old country. The letters were written in a voice he remembered as if it had been a room, precise, wry, and never sentimental without reason. She had known, it said, that things break, and that the city is sedulous about making loss tidy. She had known that certain corners of life are worth guarding because they shelter the small things that make life tender. Books borrowed and returned, stray animals fed, hands steadied for the first time in months. She had argued then with a bureaucrat about the shape of the land and had persuaded a handful of neighbors to tuck the garden into a protective clause, a clause seldom used but capable, if certain conditions were met, of preserving an area of communal land. She had recorded the clause in a ledger, she wrote, and had kept a key to a metal cabinet in which the formal declarations and necessary proof were kept. proof that could be retrieved when the time required voices and signatures. He read as if the letters were scaffolding. There in the folded paper was the instruction he had found. The key belonged not to some romantic or arcane chest, but to a municipal deposit, a metal cabinet in the council archive, a place where deeds and protective clauses lay in bureaucratic sleep. She had visited the archive on a morning after a rain, and had pressed the paper into the hand of a clerk with a small private charge. She had expected, the letter said, that perhaps there would come a day when these small, legal protections would be needed, and that, if the person who had loved her should ever feel the world receding, he might be told how to act and where to find the proof. It felt to him like both cruelty and kindness. Cruelty that the burden of memory should be left to be made legible. Kindness that she had thought to make it legible in a way a clerk could believe. He imagined her, pen poised, making the sort of quiet decisions that spare others the need to invent reasons for grief's claim. The letters did not speak only of law. Within them were small moral instructions as well, advice to ask for help, to accept improbably timed company, to speak plainly in the face of men whose language was only profit. She had been, in her way, a strategist for tenderness. The practical question presented itself with the ruthless logic of the world. To reach the cabinet required proof of identity she had named, and the use of a key that fit the lock of a drawer in the council's archive. The letters had detailed the precise cupboard, the name under which the declaration had been filed, and the account of the clerk who might remember a woman who had been particularly insistent about the protection of small places. The chest also contained a small stamped envelope, a card, bearing the clerk's name and the year in which she had written the protective note. The handwriting, he thought, was a map. He could almost hear the thought forming, sharp as frost. If he could retrieve the declaration, the garden's legal status might be read anew. The developer's men were corporeal realities with briefcases and schedules. Legal declarations existed in a different kind of reality, one that required patience and paper and the presence of a person who had been named as custodian. His old profession, the parts that had been dulled by sorrow, hummed with the possibility that this paper might be an instrument that could change the balance. But there was another seam to the letter, a personal note written last, almost as an afterthought. She had written to him directly, "Do not carry this alone. If you have the courage to act, gather those who remember. Bring witnesses. If you cannot come, send someone who will speak clear and true." She had asked him to live. She had written with the gentle brutality of the loved that he must not let small grief become a private mausoleum. Instead, he must trade that grief for action that honors what had been loved. The page ended with a single sentence that landed like a small bell in his chest. "The fig will always find a crack. So must you." Reading that line felt like stepping into a sun that had been shuttered for a long time. The world was not suddenly healed, but something in him altered its angle. Grief had been his teacher in absence. Now grief had been turned into a ledgered responsibility. He was not simply the man who had lost. He was an instrument of the woman's ongoing plan. His hands, which had counted and balanced numbers for so many years, found their old dexterity in organizing witnesses, composing a letter to the council with the evidence enclosed, and calling the clerk named in the stamped envelope. Outside, the boots were less rhetorical and more assertive. The developer's men patrolled the arch. Voices rose and clipped instruction. The tall man and the old woman moved like seasoned choristers to marshal the neighbors, an act that felt like an ordinary miracle. This would be the moment, he realized. Either the chest would be read in some official room and the council would accept its obligation, or the developer's clean-edged schedule would finish the garden with a sweep and a polite notice. The choice depended on a hinge that was not force but the recognition of law. If the paperwork was legible and the clerk remembered, then a bureaucratic pause might grant the garden time for the community. To argue for its cause, he went to the telephone. Booth in the square, the kind that still lived beneath the shadow of the arch, and made a call. The clerk answered with the practiced caution of someone who waters plants for a living and has reason to be wary. That voice, worn by years of forms, paused only once when the name of his late wife was spoken, and then the clerk's tone shifted with recognition and a touch of something like regret. "Yes," the clerk said. "I remember. She was particular. Come by with the key. We'll pull the file. There are procedures, but bring witnesses." There was a small bureaucratic music in that acceptance. The clerk's voice had not declared salvation, but it had promised a slow, legal hearing. The man felt an old confidence return not in fullness but as an instrument. He had the chest, the key, and a witness list forming among neighbors. They gathered names and signatures as if signing a paper might be a way to reenact the small rituals of being seen. The path to the council building was short in distance but full in consequence. He led the procession. Some would call it a march, though there was no anger in it, only steady insistence. Past the tram lines and into the hallways, whose marble had been polished by men who valued stone above soil. The cat had not followed. He had left the animal in the garden with the old woman, a sigil of the life that was being defended. The tall man stayed at his shoulder. The child clutched his other hand, and neighbors came in a small tide, as if a thing had called for saying aloud what had been private. He carried the key like an offering. At the council offices, the air smelled of archive dust and lemon polish. A woman at reception peered at them as if they were an odd species, people who cared for weeds. The clerk appeared, slower in movement than the telephone voice had implied, and then more solemn. He led them into a back room where rows of metal cabinets stood like the teeth of a well-fed machine. The clerk produced a key ring and, with a small formal ceremony that felt almost comical, unlocked the drawer whose number matched the one on the letter. The drawer yielded its contents, declarations, maps, and a note of protection that had been filed with the care of someone who did not trust memory alone. When the declaration was read aloud, it had the quiet force of law. It declared the garden a site of communal interest. It named conditions under which displacement required a process and time for public consultation. It was not an absolute defense. Law rarely offers absolutes, but it provided a pause, a legal requirement that the developer consult publicly and provide an assessed report before clearing. That pause, he realized, could be enough. It was a hinge that could buy a season, possibly more. It asked for time and for testimony, and for the sort of public accounting the developer had not anticipated. But paperwork is not the decisive thing the way a sword is decisive. Paper required someone who could press it like a lever in the right machinery. The clerk, however, had closed his file with a weary hand and said, "This will not stop them if they have an injunction, or if they move before the process is complete. You have a window." The words were a recognition of the practical limits of documentary persuasion. The pause, the clerk indicated, might grant them a hearing, but it might not be enough to prevent a determined and well-financed drive to clear. As they left the council building, a roar moved through the city the way storms move, understood by the people who live by schedules. A van bearing the developer's emblem rolled up to the arch. Men in reflective vests moved with the kind of efficiency trained by contracts. They produced, from a parcel wedged beneath the dashboard, a glossy sheet of paper with a judge's seal, an injunction that, if genuine, could overrule the pause the declaration demanded. The man felt the air become both thinner and heavier. The developer's representative, a man with a polished voice and a handshake that suggested friendly conquest, displayed the document with the polished calm of someone who holds the last word in a debate. He had procured an emergency order, he said, signed that morning, allowing immediate clearance. The paper looked final. Its edges were crisp. For a moment, everything seemed to set like a tide pooling in its bay, inevitable and unmoved by small human hands. This is the point where decisive action is demanded, where the true mettle of a person is tested. The man could have stepped back, folded the chest, and let the legal rituals take their course at the pace of wheels and signatures. He could have let the clerk's declaration light like a lantern in a dusty room, and then be consumed by the practical business of urban renewal. But the woman's last advice, "Do not carry this alone," sounded like a rope in his ear. He had been reclaimed by communal care. He would not hand it over to rolled paper without effort. He made a choice that felt like a breaking and a mending in a single breath. He would demand a temporary injunction himself. Right there, in the arch, he would invoke the clerk's declaration and the signatures. He positioned himself between the developer's men and the fig, and he read aloud the council's protection and the clerk's note, as if reading a story that the city had to acknowledge. His voice, at first trembling, found steadiness in the act of address. Numbers and names rendered into claims that an institution could not entirely ignore. He called for witnesses to sign an immediate affidavit in the presence of someone who could administer an oath. The developer's representative smiled in that way. People smile at obstinacy. He had lawyers. He had papers. He suggested politely that the man should go through legal channels if he wished, that law was a place of procedure, not sermon, and that clearing could proceed until such channels produced a different order. He spoke the language of inevitability with the charm of indifference. Then the unexpected fulcrum of the day revealed itself, not in law, but in the smallness of a neighbor's act. The tall man produced a recording, a file of voice testimonies collected by a young volunteer who had been cataloging the garden's services. The voice of the clerk recorded, affirmed the woman's intervention. The child's voice described the fig's shadow. The old woman recited the list of stray cats tended and books loaned. The recording, simple and human, had the odd power to fold the paper into people's lives. The developer's men looked momentarily confused. Their papers had not expected a chorus that smelled of bread and old coal. The pause that followed felt less like legal victory than like an honest reckoning. The representative's phone rang. He listened, then lowered his voice with the sort of computation that happens when profit meets paperwork and time. He said he had to consult with his head office. He asked for a few hours. The crowd exhaled in staggered relief. They had bought a sliver of time. They celebrated with the low, grateful laughter that attends borrowed breaths. The man felt something like a return. He had, in the arc of a day, shifted from the occupant of a small room who counted grief like accounts to someone who could marshal a living petition with the measured voice he knew from ledgers. The letter from his late wife had been the match that lit a long, small flame. But the cliff that follows every victory, the awareness that the world requires continual tending, arrived as a quiet, hard fact. As dusk folded itself into the shape of the city, the tall man hurried back from a call and with a face that had lost its color whispered, "They've served a notice on the garden. It's in the arch. They plan to move in at first light." The words fell like winter's first hail. In that instant, the man's chest tightened. He had won a pause in the law, but legal instruments can be swift or slow depending on how men choose to wield them. The document the developer had procured might still be a delayed instrument. The hours they'd been given could be measured in the bending of the day. And the key, the letters, the clerk's memory. They had bought some time but not sanctuary. The fig's leaves glinted as if in confirmation of this fragile victory. A season won, not a war. The cliffhanger roared then like a distant train. Men in uniforms had already begun to catalog the garden's objects. Chairs stacked, a kettle boxed. The crowd formed a loose human ring around the fig as if to mark a line on a map. The man tightened his grip on the chest. The cat, though small, leapt up and placed its paw on the fitting of the wooden box as if to claim it. He held the key in his palm, its metal cool and present like an argument. They had a declaration and witnesses. They had a community ready to face dawn. But outside the archway, the developer's men had produced another paper, something that smelled of faster machinery than local law. A vehicle idled, its engine a promise of efficiency. From it stepped a man whose face the city recognized, a judge's bailiff, eyes trained to move anything that delays the law's tidy course. He presented a fresh document with an official seal and the sort of curt language that permits immediate action in certain cases. He had been quiet until now, and his arrival reframed the entire morning. The man felt the old ledger close and reopen, this time with a stranger's hand moving the pen. He had the chest. He had letters and witnesses. He had the cat and a community who would stand in the arch. But law can be swift when commanded by certain offices, and time had always been a commodity that tilted at being in short supply. He looked down at the key and then up at the face of the bailiff. Everything narrowed. He could feel the weight of decision, the choice between retreat and the small miracle of collective defiance. The fig's leaves shivered and the cat blinked with a slow, decisive calm. The man's voice rose, not quite steady but loud enough to gather attention as he asked the bailiff, politely, and with the courage of someone who had taken advice from a letter, to wait while the clerk's declaration was officially recorded and an emergency application filed. There was a moment, a heartbeat between question and answer. And then the bailiff reached into his pocket for a paper that would either stop them or force their hands. The air tilted. The cat pressed its head into the man's knee and purred as if to make him remember what was at stake, before a single legal instrument determined a dawn's work. Would you stay, if you were in their place? They stood in a circle like small stubborn stamps pressed against a sheet of paper. Neighbors. The child with dirt under his nails. The baker with flour on his cuff. The tall man whose hands smelled of soil. The old woman whose voice could settle a kettle. Between them, the fig spread a modest crown, its leaves catching the light as if to say, "We are still here." The man felt the key in his palm like a cool truth. Across the threshold, the developer's men had boots and a glossy injunction. Inside the ring, they had witness and the careful force of names. The bailiff's document lay in the hands of a man whose job was to make the city obey the faster order. For a moment, the world seemed to hold that thin hour like a coin balanced on edge. The cat, easy and small, wound among ankles and placed itself upon the wooden box as if to claim it. The old woman set a cup of tea down between two palms, and the child pressed a crayon drawing into the man's hand, as if to remind him what was being protected. Not only plants and benches, but places where people might learn the old craft of belonging. He breathed like a man learning a new measure. The fight had been summoned. Now the work of ordinary courage, paper, petition, witness would have to be done. Outside engines idled, inside hands joined. The fig waited, patient as weather. The first thing that fell away was posture. Where once he might have worn silence like armor, it came off easily now, replaced by the small, eager garment of work. There were practical urgencies to attend, an emergency application to lodge with the court, the gathering of affidavits, the collection of the signatures that would give the clerk's declaration its human ballast. He moved with a steadiness that surprised even himself. Lists were drawn, duties apportioned, the old office skill muscles awake to hold the strain. A lawyer volunteered, an unromantic woman with a patient face who had once been a neighbor and now brought a briefcase instead of a loaf. Her name was Farah. She read the clerk's declaration and the developer's injunction as if reading two different weather reports, and then she arranged them into a plan, a temporary injunction to pause any clearing until the courts could properly hear the council's declaration, affidavits sworn before a commissioner, and a request for a day's stay while evidence was transferred to the judge's chambers. Her voice moved in the room like thread through a needle, precise, sure, and without flourish. The man found himself translating, in public, the lessons his old work had taught him. He explained the technicalities to the crowd, not to impress but to enable action. He set down the ledger of events, the day the ribbon had been found, the note from a woman who had tended small protections, the names and times, the calls to the clerk, the confirmation of the filing. He taught others how to witness with a thoroughness that made their small memories a form of proof. Dates, who had seen what, the way the cat had arrived and been fed. To his own surprise, organizing the human facts felt as intimate as polishing his wife's photograph. Night descended like a blanket, but not one of resignation. People took shifts at the arch. Those who could not commit to legal language brought tureens of soup and flasks of tea. Those with jobs by day pledged hours by night. A bench became a roster. The tall man and the baker kept a vigil near the fig. The child brought a pillow for anyone who needed to sleep. The man who had feared he would be overwhelmed by company found himself nourished by it. He slept in a chair with the cat curled across his wrist, which was the kind of contact that made grief feel less like an accusation and more like a companion that could be carried. When dawn started ponding light into the tunnel of the arch, a small parade formed to take their filed documents to the courthouse, the clerk's declaration, the affidavits, the petitions. They walked with as much dignity as a company of citizens could muster, a peculiar dignity, not dressed for triumph but exhibited in the steadiness of ordinary attire. The baker carried a stack of warm rolls wrapped in cloth as an offering to the clerk at the courthouse. The child traced the path with a crayon map. The man, with the key tucked into the inner pocket of his coat, felt an almost ridiculous gratitude for a life that could still arrange itself into meaning. At the courthouse, bureaucracy kept its practiced face. The judge's secretary was an efficient woman who moved like a metronome, and the files lived behind glass. They submitted their papers, the declaration from the council cabinet, the witness statements, the recordings that had been made of neighbors speaking to the garden's roll. Farah spoke with the courtesy of someone who knew the proper code, calmly, plainly, insistently. The judge assigned a clerk the task of reviewing their application for a stay. It was not a guarantee, only the machinery of due process making a space for voice. Outside the courthouse, news traveled like a modest current. A local reporter took an interest, small human stories being the sort of thing that cut through the noise, and a short piece went online that afternoon. The piece was not flashy. It described a group of neighbors fighting to keep a garden, and it quoted the man's reading aloud of the letter, "The fig will always find a crack. So must you." His words, which had never before felt destined for a headline, made their way into feeds. Someone who lived across town read the story and came by the arch the next day with seedlings to donate. Public pressure is a strange animal. It arrives in small parts that swell when others lend attention. The developer noticed this rise and tried to counter with glossy cards and a friendly spokesman who explained, with sedation, that development would bring jobs and improved pavements. But charm cannot counter the stubborn testimony of a child who draws a tree and the woman who feeds birds. People who once passed the arch without thought began to linger, and having learned the tale, to sign petitions. A professor from a nearby university offered to write an op-ed about the social value of minute commons. A small radio station called for an interview. The city's public imagination, gently poked, began to flex. Still, practical pressures remained. The developer's lawyers moved through the same filings with less sentiment and more haste. They produced documents that claimed immediate rights and suggested that the injunction the group sought was unlikely to stick beyond procedural niceties. The man realized then that law without muscle is like a boat without a keel, easily swayed. That realization could have been discouraging if there had not been a harness of community to catch the fall. A crucial lever appeared in the form of an old municipal rule, one the woman had known and had tucked into the fold of her letter. A clause that required an environmental and social impact assessment when a certain percentage of urban green spaces were proposed for removal. The council declaration had invoked that clause. When the council clerk read the declaration in the judge's chamber and testified that it had been filed in good faith, the judge's clerk hesitated. The developer's lawyers argued for speed. The clerk's pause was an instrument that responded, as often such instruments do, to the weight of process. The judge agreed to a short stay to permit a proper hearing, if the group could show they had active witnesses, and that removal would cause undue hardship to local users. It was not victory, but it was the breathing space that would let people do what the woman's letters had asked: live, gather witnesses, and make their case known to a court that liked documents in the public record. The man exhaled as if for the first time in months, and in that exhale felt the thread of his life stitched back into the larger fabric. He celebrated not with triumph, but with teacups and the cracking of warm bread. The cat, with the dignity of one who had initiated serious work, took a ribbon from the child and tucked it into the crook of the man's coat. Payoffs occasioned small, satisfying moments that read like the moral margin of an old book. The bay tree by the window, to which he had once given tiny rituals of water, responded with a sudden flush and sent a new shoot, as if to answer his attention. The fig, which had been planted years ago by hands that had loved a ring of neighbors into being, set a small fruit that autumn. He watched the fig become an emblem, a small, persistent yield of the sort that proves patience can have returns. People kept arriving with odd donations. A retired locksmith offered his skills and volunteered to help secure the garden's possessions. He had a laugh that sounded like bolt and key falling into place. The locksmith's involvement was practical but also symbolic. The key they had found was not just a piece of metal, but a signal that some doors are meant to be reopened. A student photographer made a series of portraits of the community, capturing the lines of faces that, when gathered, made a portrait of municipal belonging. The man, whose face had been honed by more private sorrow, found himself in one photograph, standing by the fig, a page in his hand. The developer, stung by the rising attention and the legal pause, shifted tactics. Instead of blunt force, they offered negotiation. A plan to relocate the garden, with promises of a curated green space and a plaque commemorating what had been there. The offer was sweet in language and bitter in its assumptions, that the value of a place is movable like furniture. The group argued that relocation cannot transplant history or the small economies of care. The bread shelf, the exact angle of sunlight on the bench, the way stray cats learn to navigate corners. Farah negotiated with cool precision. She pointed out that the garden's value was not merely botanical but social, and that the council's declaration required due consideration. The developer, to their credit, offered meetings and some concessions, but the community's moral claim remained: preservation, not replacement. In the quieter hours, the man walked the perimeter with the cat at his heels. He noticed things he had once missed in his singular grief: the child's small handwriting on a notice pinned to a tree, the way the old woman's hands had acquired new strength from constant tending, the way the tall man's laugh had softened. He spoke less now of the woman who had been his anchor. Instead, he spoke of what she had done, how she had seen a city's seam and used the right clerk's name to stitch it sturdily. He read aloud often the sentence from her letter: "The fig will always find a crack. So must you." The phrase became a kind of communal whisper. Children repeated it as a thing to say before planting seeds. Grown men quoted it in council meetings. A moment arrived when the developer's lead representative requested a formal meet at the Arch. He came with a file, some brochures, and a disarming smile. He spoke of progress and of a future that could include the garden's memory, and gestures that took the shape of compensations. The man listened, feeling the old temptation to be placated by polished promises, but he had acquired, in the thin crucible of this struggle, a new standard: not the exchange of comfort for convenience, but the recognition that some things carry an intrinsic value that cannot be rendered in glossy pamphlets. "You must understand," the man said quietly, not to the representative but to the small crowd gathered. "This is not only soil. It is a place where we learn to be small again, humble in our attachments, and that humbleness is not a liability but a way of being in the city." His voice, which once had been used only to balance ledgers, now balanced argument and tenderness. The developer's smile faltered because it could not easily quantify that speech. There were tender reconciliations as well. The old acquaintance, the man who had once occupied his life with dinners and calls, returned one evening, cheeks hollowed by some modest reversal, and asked to help. He brought contacts and a willingness to sit in the Arch for an afternoon. The man accepted. In doing so, he learned an old lesson: that pride can be a thief and that admission of need is not surrender. They worked together on a press release that framed the garden as a living patchwork of the city's memory. The acquaintance's presence did not erase the past. It added the curious joy of being recognized for the work you had silently begun. Even the cat received recognition. A volunteer sewed a small collar, and the child painted on a tiny medal fashioned from scrap brass as a symbol of its diplomatic service. The cat, who had never sought titles, accepted these small adornments with the simple dignity of an animal that had always been doing precisely what it needed to do. Yet the fight had its darker hours. There were nights when a truck idled at the end of the alley, and men checked their phones in low light. There were rumors that the developer would call for another, stronger injunction, that courts sometimes move suddenly in favor of efficiency. The man's sleep returned in fits. He woke with the impression of boots at his door. Each morning he would look to see whether the fig's leaves had been disturbed and find them, more often than not, intact. Each undisturbed leaf felt like a small legal victory. The community grew adept at small theatricalities that were not contrived so much as necessary. They organized a children's play to be performed under the Arch, an absurd gentle court of young actors who performed the story of a city that learned to listen to its smallest voices. The performance drew a crowd, and a local blogger wrote a memoir-like piece that spread with curious tenderness. People who had never cared about municipal hearings began to ask questions about the way cities make decisions. Gradually, the developer conceded a more patient stance. In a meeting arranged by Farah, they offered a compromise. Delay, they said, until the assessment could be complete. Consult, they said, and if the council's report suggested the site had minimal protected value, then some alternative would be considered. It was an unsatisfying middle term, but it granted the garden a breathing room longer than the suddenness of the injunction would have allowed. The judge's clerk had given them a hearing. The developer chose negotiation over forced removal, at least for now. The man felt something like a return to himself that was not a closure, but a reconstitution. The ledger of his life had expanded. It now contained the names of practical strangers who had become allies. He found himself enjoying tasks that once would have seemed trivial: binding bundles of petitions, supervising a small fence made from reclaimed lumber, teaching the child how to affix a proper label to a donation pot. The practicalities were not heroic but reverent. Each nail driven was a small vow. In the hush between action and consequence, a quiet miracle happened in the garden. The fig, perhaps unreliably in the way of living things, sent out a new green shoot that curled like a question mark toward the light. Someone, perhaps the child, found a small, forgotten seed buried among compost and planted it by the bay tree. The seed germinated, a pale thread pushing through dark soil. The man crouched near it and pressed, his palm to the earth as if to say thank you to a world that had given him back a task to tend. He began to understand that the transformation he had undergone was not merely a public stance but a private re-education. Grief had not been erased. It had been transmuted into purpose. The woman whose handwriting had been the map had not asked him to forget but to act. In acting, he found both the memory and the map alive. Nights when the ache returned were soothed by the knowledge that his hands had uses other than holding absence. He had become in a small way an instrument of the city's kindness. There were small luminous moments that confirmed the thread of change. The child who had once been a silent companion read aloud at the city hearing, telling in a plain voice how the garden had kept him from loneliness. The locksmith who had volunteered turned out to be a man with a laugh that taught people to feel safe around metal. He made a simple plaque that the tall man affixed to the arch. This place tended by neighbors. It was not a boast but a record. And then, in an afternoon that tasted like warm bread, the man received a note from the clerk. The judge had scheduled a hearing and required more formal testimony. The applicant, the developer, had to show cause. They had bought time. Now they must use it. It was a sober summons and a practical one. He would have to stand in court and speak for the community, not only as a ledger keeper but as a man who had learned again how to be seen. He felt the old fear in his throat, but also the strange ease of a man who had rehearsed his bearings in the arch. At twilight, as people gathered to prepare for the next day, the cat hopped onto the man's lap and presented, with that feline clarity that makes humans forgive the world, a small object, a thin strip of brass, polished by paws and perhaps clipped from a discarded metal tag. It was not the council key, it was not a legal instrument. It was, in its humble way, a medal. The cat nudged it into his palm as if to say, "Keep faith." He laughed then, a short sound that held some surprise and relief, and tied the brass strip to his notebook with a ribbon. It was a small token, but one he would carry into the hearing. "Has an animal ever changed your life in a way you didn't expect?" asked the old woman quietly, as they set plates and folded petitions into envelopes. It was not merely an invitation for audience reflection, but a circle of human curiosity that let each of them speak of the ways the cat had made a path for their courage. The man thought of the simple mechanics of daily life, the cat that had come to a threshold and made it a door, and how such small insistences had the power to unseat even a judge's timetable. The night before the hearing, the arch was lit by lanterns. People took turns keeping watch over the fig. They told stories, some of the woman who left the letters, some of their own reasons for coming, and in those stories there was a slow stitching. When he lay down, the man did not sleep like a man who had surrendered. He slept like one who had prepared his case and in the morning would go to speak not alone but with a chorus at his back. The cat settled at his feet and purred with the kind of steady rhythm that had become a metronome to his new life. There remained the knowledge that courts are capacious, that decisions can twist, that life is not a neat arc. But the heavy immediacy of eviction had been postponed, and the things that mattered, witness, voice, testimony, and the foliation of small community actions, had been assembled. The fig's leaves glinted under the lanterns as if applauding the care they had received. The man in his pocket, the brass strip, and in his heart the woman's counsel, felt himself ready to stand. He had learned to translate absence into action, and that, he understood, might be the truest answer to any loss. Has an animal ever changed your life in a way you didn't expect? If so, remember that sometimes the smallest companions ask us to do the largest things simply by waiting at the threshold. The morning of the hearing dawned like a held breath, released, pale and careful, as if the city itself were trying not to startle the small things it had almost lost. Lanterns from the night before had been folded away. Footprints still damp on the archway told of those who had kept watch. He stood with the cat at his feet and the brass strip tied to his notebook. feeling the weight of a life newly given duties. The fig's leaves gleamed with a dew that read like punctuation, a sentence not yet finished. All around the arch, neighbors gathered in soft clusters, faces that had learned to look together. The tall man checked a stack of witness statements, with the concentration of someone sorting seeds. The child clutched a crayon drawing as if it were an affidavit. The old woman moved with the surety of one who tends kettles in truth. The developers' vans were parked across the street like placards of future certainty. Between them the cat moved, a small, patient punctuation, and when it looped its tail against his ankles he felt, for the first time in a long time, that solidity might be restored by ordinary things. The court would weigh paper and testimony, law and habit, money and memory. The city would talk in forms. The people would speak in small lives. He inhaled and felt the garden's history press like a lullaby to his ribs. If this place was to remain, it would be because a chorus of small voices had learned to sing together. They filed into the courtroom in the ordinary, dignified way of those who carry more than documents. They carried stories and the mustard scent of bread and the quiet courage that belongs to people who have kept watch. The judge sat high, a presence of slow calm, and the room smelled faintly of old paper and hope. Farah moved with the authority of someone who knew how to make law understand human things. She placed the council's declaration on the bench with a reverence equal to its meaning. The man, whose hands had the steady habits earned by ledgers, and loss presented the wooden box and the letters as if the artifacts themselves were witnesses. The developers' council spoke first, all polished certainties and plans of urban virtue. He painted a future in which neat pavements and gleaming facades made the city better. Jobs, commerce, a tidy image of progress. He spoke of rights purchased and the burdens of delay, and the words fell like scaffolding, precise, impressive, but not warm. When he finished, there was a hum in the room, the ordinary pause that follows a practiced argument. Then the man spoke. He did not stand to declaim dramatic sentences. He spoke in the tone that had returned to him in service of the garden, careful, honest, and exacting in small truths. He read aloud the letters, the handwriting of the woman who had planned for small protections, and the judge leaned forward as if to catch the cadence. He told of the cat and the ribbon, and the way a sapling found its place in a crack. He described the bench where people could come to remember without being judged for the intimacy of their mourning. He read the child's testimony, the locksmith's statement, the recording of neighbors' voices. In the simple economy of his speech, there was something a judge, once a man not immune to life's small invoices, could not easily dismiss. The clerk from the council recounted with modest exactness the filing and the intention behind the clause the woman had invoked. The clerk's voice, plain, practiced, carried its own authority. It said, "This was filed with care to preserve small communal spaces when they were threatened." He explained the conditions under which such protection required meaningful consultation. Law, it turned out, has a place for the small and the stubborn if someone had taken the time to make it legible. Then came the human chorus, neighbors offering testimony. The baker, flower on his cuff, described how bread had been passed to those who came to the arch and how that sharing had kept people from starving on nights that seemed long enough to forget farewells. The child spoke without theater of being, given a place where he could plant and watch a seed become something. His voice carried the uncluttered power of small truths. The locksmith, with his laugh like old keys, testified to repairing benches not for names, but so that old knees had a place to rest. The tall man described the way hands learned again to be useful. The old woman spoke of the music box wound between cups, and the student photographer presented portraits that made the judge look at faces he might otherwise measure as statistics. In reply, the developers' council offered glossy renderings of new pavements and a promise of a park elsewhere. Relocation, they called it, as if history could be moved like a box of books. But faces do not transfer so readily. A park elsewhere is a promise of a paper future. A place where neighbors met and small economies kept loneliness at bay, is not only soil but a habitation of habit. The judge considered the two forms of value, the measurable value and the life-crafted value. That consideration is where the small things of the world often find their fate. When the judge's hand reached for the gavel, the room drew breath. He spoke slowly, with the kind of gentleness men who have read more than law sometimes use. He acknowledged the developer's rights, the company's investments, and the city's demand for renewal. Yet he also spoke of the council's declaration, of legal instruments designed to protect communal spaces, and of the human witness that had been assembled, a chorus of neighbors whose daily acts had made the garden a real part of the civic fabric. He ruled that an immediate full clearance could not proceed without a thorough and public assessment of social and environmental impact, as the clause invoked by the woman required. The injunction sought by the developer would be stayed until the court had time to hear both sides fully after a formal assessment. It was neither an absolute victory nor a defeat. It was time. Time in that moment felt like a currency more precious than any promise. It was enough to let the garden breathe. It allowed papers to be read, voices to be heard, and the city's machinery to engage with something other than profit margins. For the people who had stood in the arch, it was a season earned. They left the courtroom with a thin, sustained triumph in their steps. One not triumphant in the way of banners, but steady in the way of hands that know how to work. Back in the arch, the city seemed to exhale as if some small lung had been reopened. The tall man hugged the child with a laugh that sounded fragile and then strong. The old woman, teary as steam, wound the music box and let the tune float like gratitude. The man walked to the fig and ran his fingers along its trunk, as if to confirm that the bark would continue to remember their hands. The cat wound between them and sat upon the wooden box, placing its small paw on the lid as if to claim the settlement as a communal matter. The brass strip in his notebook clicked softly when he tucked it back inside. They set about the slow work of transforming time into something durable. Meetings with councilors were arranged, an environmental assessment was scheduled, and citizens were called to give testimony. The developer was required now by court order to consult more fully and provide a report of how the planned development would affect not just traffic and property, but the lives that had been interwoven there. The law had given them a stage. They needed to fill it with evidence of value that is not always quantified. In the following weeks, the garden's life effloresced into forms that proved its claim. Volunteers organized a schedule for upkeep and a tiny library of donated books for passers-by. The child's crayon drawing was framed and pinned to a post, an emblem of the human stake in the place. The locksmith fashioned a small box, this one not hidden but displayed, where neighbors could deposit notes and small tokens that spoke of what the place meant. The man found himself again in the pleasant tyranny of responsibilities, a roster, a request form, a ledger of tasks. He walked between people and felt his old muscles, both for counting and for caring, click into alignment. Farah, whose calm had been a necessity in court, advised that the garden consider a formal constitution of stewardship, a simple civic instrument that would bind neighbors as caretakers and make their involvement a visible civic claim. The group agreed, and in the slow joy of making things official, they formed a small committee that met by the fig and recorded minutes like prayers. The man found himself chairing those meetings with a modest pride, formerly given to balance sheets. He enjoyed in an almost shocking way the measure of saying aloud what they had done and making it durable on paper. The developer, engaged by the requirement of public patronage, proposed mitigation measures. Some were reasonable: protections of certain mature trees, signage indicating the communal space, and an offer to contribute to a small fund for community projects. Other offers were less substantial, proposals to shift community activities to a curated green shelf tucked elsewhere. The group negotiated with the steadiness that comes from newly found purpose, extracting concessions that ensured the garden's continuity on the arch's ground. In time, a formal agreement was made. The development would proceed in part, but the arch and the garden would be conserved as a designated community green, with funds set aside by the developer for maintenance and local programming. It was not the absolute protection the old woman's letter had hoped for. It was an arrangement fitted to the world as it was, imperfect, practical, human. When the agreement was signed a season later in a small ceremony under the fig, there was the kind of gentle rejoicing that belongs to people who know the labor of keeping small things. The judge's clerk, who had been instrumental in dredging the cabinet for the paper that had set the whole ark in motion, attended and brought with him a small wooden token, engraved with the filing number of the council's declaration. He pressed it into the man's hand with a shy smile. It was the city's acknowledgement, literal and symbolic, that the legal machinery had been used for tenderness. The cat received its own modest honors. The child fastened a small ribbon to its collar, a red ribbon that matched the one it had once tied to the man's door, and the community made a tin medal for its role in the early days of the struggle. The cat, who had never sought praise, accepted the adornments as a being that had known the smallest appropriate gifts: warmth, a saucer of milk, and the right pocket on a coat in which to nap. More profound, however, was what the cat gave to the man. On the morning after the agreement, the cat presented him with a small living thing, a kitten no larger than the man's palm, mewling softly in fur still dotted with the dust of alleys. It was an offering in the cat's native grammar, a bridging of householders and the future. The man, whose hands remembered how to be careful, received the kitten as if it were an answer. Where once the house had held a photograph and a teacup, it now held a warm body that required attention and did not demand to be told how to grieve. He took the kitten in and felt with a sudden clarity that responsibility can be a salve. The small creature's heartbeat under his thumb taught him rhythms that were not merely the metronome of absence, but the pulse of something to steward. The cat watched with slow approval and curled upon the man's knee, its tail like a comma in his life. The community continued to stitch the garden into the city's appointed fabric. Workshops happened on weekends, seed exchanges, story hours, repair clinics. The man taught a class on practical record-keeping, which delighted him more than he expected. People from other neighborhoods visited to learn how a small place could be defended by collective insistence. They went home with seeds and new languages for civic care. The developer, whose initial plans had been altered by the insistence of a few, now contributed to a fund that paid for the garden's teacher and its modest repairs. Money had not prevailed by itself. It had been channeled into care because people insisted that the place mattered. At the center of the arch, the fig grew thick with leaves, then flowers, then small late fruits, unspectacular gifts that tasted of sun and patience. The bay tree on the man's sill sent out a new sprig, and one of its leaves, months later, was plucked and placed inside his notebook, an ongoing talisman. In the quiet hours, he would sit by the window with the kitten curled in his hands and a book open on his lap. Sometimes he would bow his head and whisper to the photograph on the mantel. Grief still lived there, present and honored, but grief no longer lived at the center of everything. It had become a companion at the edge of a life engaged in small miracles. The woman's writing, which had begun the ark, remained a guide. Her sentence, "On the fig will always find a crack, so must you," was used in the garden as a proverb. They printed it on a small plaque and affixed it to the arch, a public piece of private counsel. Children learned to say it when they planted seeds, and older men murmured it when they tied a support to a sapling. The phrase, in its economy, carried a moral that Kipling might have recognized. That persistence, not spectacle, makes the city humane. In the years that followed, the garden became a small kind of school, of patience, of diplomacy, of how to arrange signatures and how to brew a proper pot of tea for a neighbor who cannot leave their bed. The man aged less as grief's prisoner and more as a steady steward. He taught the child how to bind petitions, and the child, now older, taught him how to use a smartphone to share seed-swapping events. The old woman passed along recipes that were more memory than instruction. The cat had kittens, and they grew into a small colony that learned the arch as their territory of office and affection. When he walked beneath the fig, now taller and given the dignity of seasons, people would call to him and he would answer in the soft, exact phrases of someone who had been given back a life of purpose. There were quiet recognitions that the world had not become gentler because of them. Developers would continue to plan, and cities would require negotiation between what is new and what must be preserved. But the garden had become a precedent and a sermon in small practical terms. Paper and tenderness together can alter a timetable. The man, who had learned to balance grief in the private rooms of his life, had discovered that grief could be a lever when paired with action. On an evening years later, with the fig heavy with shade and the kitten, now fat and confident, leaping through the low branches, the man sat surrounded by neighbors and told the story once again. The ribbon, the chest, the clerk who had remembered, the court that had been given pause. He told it not as an act of triumph, but as an instruction, how to keep a place by being present for it. Children listened, and grown men and women folded the story into their own lives like a rule of thumb. He finished by taking the brass strip, polished now by years of use, and tying it to the ring of keys he carried. He felt that in this small ritual was a final, quiet reconciliation, that the instruments of life were often humble. He had been hollowed by grief once and then mended in the public way that mending truly is. Slowly, with neighbors applying stitches and with small hands exchanging bread, the cat full of kittens padded to his lap and settled its warm body upon his knees. The man stroked fur, felt the kitten's soft spine, and in the rustle of those small movements heard the city steady itself around a patch of green. The final gift the cat gave him was not a key or a letter, but the ordinary art of belonging. It taught him that love can be requested not with a trumpet, but with a simple, persistent presence, showing up at thresholds, bringing ribbons, and waiting. That patient insistence had woken the man enough to let him begin again. In the manner of fables, there is one last clear law. Cities keep the things that people defend with tenderness. The fig's root, stubborn and small, would continue to find its cracks. So would the hearts that learned to hold responsibility for each other. The man, old now in the gentle way that presences accrue, looked out from his window at the bay tree and then down to the arch where laughter rose like steam. He felt neither the sting of absence nor the emptiness of a life lost. He felt the quiet fullness of a life that had been returned to work. Not for spectacle, but for the simple craft of keeping. You stayed with me till the very end. Thank you. If it felt like a soft purr in your heart, subscribing helps me share more stories like this.